The October air in Savannah carried that particular weight Daniel had grown to recognize over his 38 years in the city. Humid enough to cling to your shirt collar, cool enough to make you grateful for it. He walked down Bull Street every weekday evening at 6:15, his footsteps echoing off the cobblestones as the last of the golden hour light filtered through the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks. The city smelled like magnolia blossoms and river water, that specific perfume that meant home to anyone who'd spent enough time beneath Savannah's ancient canopy. Daniel worked as a restoration architect for the historic district, spending his days measuring door frames in antebellum mansions and arguing with contractors about authentic paint colors. It was meticulous work that suited his methodical nature, the kind of profession that let him disappear into measurements and blueprints rather than the messier dimensions of human connection. He'd grown comfortable with that distance, especially in the 6 years since his father's death. Tonight, like most nights, he noticed the light. It started as a glimmer, a warm amber reflection bouncing off the old-fashioned street lamp at the corner of Bull and Perry. Nothing unusual in that. Savannah's historic street lamps threw all kinds of strange refractions, depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun. But this particular gleam had been appearing for 3 weeks now, always at the same spot, always catching his eye, with an almost deliberate quality that made him pause mid-stride. Daniel stopped beneath the lamp, tilting his head as he studied the source. The light seemed to pool on the wrought-iron post, sliding down its curved neck like honey, then scattering across the sidewalk in a pattern that reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. It had a quality of intentionality, as if someone had positioned a mirror just so, though he could never locate the source. His gaze followed the light's trajectory to the corner where Clary's Cafe used to stand, now a boutique selling overpriced low-country art to tourists. But Daniel didn't see the boutique. He saw the cafe as it had been 12 years ago, when he was 26, and still believed the world might open itself to him in unexpected ways. He saw the small wrought-iron tables on the sidewalk, the chalkboard menu advertising she-crab soup and sweet tea, and the woman who had smiled at him from the corner table near the window, Sarah Brennan. The name arrived in his mind like a song he'd forgotten he knew. She'd been a few years older than him, maybe 30 at the time, with dark hair that she wore in a loose braid over one shoulder and eyes that seemed to collect light the way certain Riverstones did. She'd worked as a nurse at Memorial Hospital and had a laugh that made everyone within earshot turn toward her, not because it was loud, but because it was so genuinely delighted. They'd met by accident, literally, when Daniel had stumbled coming out of the cafe with an armload of blueprints, and she'd caught his elbow, steadying him before his drawings could scatter across Bull Street. "Careful," she'd said, her southern accent soft as creek water. "Savannah's trying to keep you here." They'd talked for 20 minutes that first day, then found themselves at Clary's at the same time the following week, then the week after that. It became a pattern, a Thursday ritual that lasted through that entire summer and into fall. Sarah never pushed for more than coffee and conversation, and Daniel, still grieving his mother's death the previous spring, had been grateful for the gentleness of her presence. She'd understood instinctively that he needed friendship more than romance, though there had been something unspoken between them, something that hummed in the spaces of their conversations like the cicadas in the oak trees. Then one Thursday in November, she simply wasn't there. Daniel waited for 30 minutes, then an hour, finally asking the cafe owner if he'd seen her. The man shrugged, said she'd mentioned something about family business out of town. Daniel left his number with the owner, but Sarah never called. He went back every Thursday for 2 months before accepting that whatever connection they'd shared had been as temporary as summer heat. Now, standing beneath the street lamp with that strange amber light pooling around his feet, Daniel felt the full weight of that loss in a way he'd never allowed himself to at the time. He'd been too numb then, too wrapped up in his own grief, to properly mourn the disappearance of someone who'd offered him such uncomplicated kindness. The light flickered once, twice, then steadied. Daniel shook his head, dismissing the tightness in his chest as nostalgia mixed with exhaustion. He'd been working 60-hour weeks on the Mercer House restoration, and lack of sleep could make a man see patterns where none existed. He turned away from the corner and continued his walk home to his apartment on Jones Street, telling himself that light was just light, that coincidence was just coincidence, and that the past was exactly where it should be, behind him. But when he glanced back over his shoulder, the amber glow was still there, warm and steady, like a candle left burning in a window for someone who might still come home. Daniel started varying his route home. It was a small rebellion against his own superstition, but by the end of October he couldn't shake the feeling that the light on Bull Street was waiting for him. So he began walking down Abercorn instead, cutting through Chippewa Square, where the Forrest Gump bench had once sat, then over to Jones Street from a different angle. The route added 7 minutes to his commute, but it felt necessary, like breaking a habit before it could calcify into something stranger. For 3 nights, it worked. He walked beneath different oaks, past different gardens overflowing with late-season camellias, and felt the peculiar relief of a man who'd successfully avoided a question he didn't want to answer. On the 4th night, he saw the light again. It appeared on Abercorn, reflecting off the fountain in Colonial Park Cemetery's wrought iron fence. The same amber quality, the same warmth that seemed to pulse rather than glare. Daniel stopped so abruptly that a young couple behind him had to swerve around him, the woman muttering something about tourists, even though Daniel had lived here his entire life. He approached the fence slowly, studying the light's behavior. It couldn't be the same source. Bull Street was 4 blocks away. This had to be a different lamp, a different angle of refraction. But the quality was identical, that honey-thick glow that seemed to gather itself purposefully rather than scatter randomly. The light pooled on the fence's upper rail, then slid down the iron bars toward a specific spot in the cemetery. Daniel's eyes followed it to a section of old graves near the eastern wall, where the stones dated back to the yellow fever epidemics of the 1800s. He'd walked past this cemetery hundreds of times, but had never noticed that particular cluster of graves, half hidden behind a dogwood tree that must have been spectacular in spring. Something drew him closer. The cemetery was closed at this hour, but the light seemed to be pointing, insistent in its direction. Daniel stood at the fence, his hands gripping the cool iron, and squinted at the headstones. Most were too weathered to read from this distance, their inscriptions eroded by 2 centuries of humidity and rain. "You looking for someone specific?" Daniel turned to find an elderly man standing beside him, a Savannah Chronicle tucked under his arm. The man had the kind of face that suggested he'd spent his whole life outdoors, deeply lined, sun-weathered, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "No, Daniel gestured vaguely at the cemetery. "The light caught my eye." The old man followed his gesture, studying the area where the amber glow still lingered on the fence. "That's the nurses' section," he said after a moment. "Back during the epidemics, they buried the nurses who died tending the sick separate from the regular graves. Sign of respect, I suppose, though it seems lonely putting them apart like that." Daniel's throat tightened. "Nurses? Memorial Hospital's predecessor used to be right near here. The nurses would volunteer during the epidemics, knowing full well they'd probably die. Most of them did." The old man shook his head. "They say some of those women still watch over the city, making sure people get home safe. Old Savannah superstition. But then again, this whole city's built on ghosts and grief, ain't it?" The light flickered once, then faded. Daniel thanked the man and continued toward home, but his mind was racing. Sarah had been a nurse. She told him stories about the hospital, about the weight of caring for people in their most vulnerable moments, about how she felt her work was a kind of calling that ran in her family. "My great-great-grandmother was a nurse during the yellow fever epidemic," she'd said once, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "She died at 32, tending to patients when everyone else had fled. I think about her sometimes, Wonder if I'd have that kind of courage. Daniel had asked her name, but Sarah had shaken her head. Lost to history. There weren't good records back then, especially for women. She's buried somewhere in Savannah, but my family never found the grave. Now, standing in front of his apartment building on Jones Street, Daniel looked up at his second-floor window. The light was there, too. It wasn't bright enough to be alarming. Just a soft, amber glow hovering near the glass, like someone had hung a small lantern just outside. But his apartment faced a brick wall with no neighboring windows, no place for a light source to originate. Daniel's heart began beating faster, a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't name. He climbed the stairs slowly, his keys ready in his hand. When he unlocked his door and stepped inside, the light was gone. His apartment looked exactly as he'd left it that morning. Dishes in the sink, architectural drawings spread across the dining table, the faint smell of coffee and old books that seemed to permeate every surface. But when he walked to the window and looked out, the light appeared again, just beyond the glass. This close, he could see it more clearly. It didn't behave like reflected lamplight or car headlights. It moved with intention, pulsing gently, and within its glow he could almost see. Daniel stepped back, his breath catching. Within the light, for just a moment, he'd seen the suggestion of a figure, a woman's silhouette. Her head tilted slightly as if listening, one hand raised in a gesture that might have been a wave, or might have been a touch against glass. Sarah. The name left his lips before he could stop it. The light brightened, pulsed twice, then faded slowly, like a candle being carried away down a long hallway. Daniel stood at his window for an hour, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. When he finally went to bed, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering every conversation he'd had with Sarah Brennan, every smile she'd offered him during that brief, bright summer when the world had felt slightly less heavy. He remembered how she'd known exactly when to speak and when to sit in comfortable silence, how she'd once brought him a book of Mary Oliver poems because she thought the poetry might help him process his grief, how she'd never asked for anything more than he could give. And he remembered the last time he'd seen her, how she'd touched his hand across the table and said, "You're going to be okay, Daniel. I know you don't believe it yet, but you will be. You're stronger than you think." He'd meant to tell her what her friendship had meant to him, but he'd been too caught up in his own sorrow to find the words. Then she was gone, and the words had stayed locked inside him for 12 years, growing heavier with time. Outside his window, the Savannah night settled into its usual symphony of sound. Distant church bells marking the hour, the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze, a calliope playing somewhere along the riverfront. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but all he could see was that amber light, warm and patient, waiting for him to understand what it had been trying to tell him all along. November arrived with unseasonably cool weather, the kind that made tourists flock to Forsyth Park in sweaters they'd optimistically packed, delighted by the novelty of southern autumn. Daniel threw himself into work with renewed intensity, spending long days at the Mercer House, measuring crown molding and arguing with contractors about the proper restoration of heart pine floors. He told himself he was focused on the project, but the truth was simpler. Staying busy kept him from thinking about the light. Except the light wouldn't be ignored. It began appearing everywhere Daniel went, always subtle, always at the edges of his awareness. At the pharmacy on Broughton Street, it reflected off the front windows just as he was leaving. At the hardware store on Whitaker, it pooled near the paint samples he'd been studying. At the corner store, where he bought his morning coffee, it flickered across the counter as the cashier handed him his change. Each time, the light seemed to be guiding his attention to something specific. At the pharmacy, it had highlighted a display of memorial candles, the kind people lit for lost loved ones. At the hardware store, it had drawn his eye to a shelf of vintage brass fixtures that reminded him of the lamp Sarah used to have in her apartment, the one time he'd picked her up for a community fundraiser. At the corner store, it had illuminated a bulletin board covered in flyers, one of which advertised a grief support group at Memorial Hospital. Daniel started keeping a journal, documenting each appearance. He was an architect. Patterns were his profession. If this was real, and he was increasingly convinced it was, then it followed some kind of logic he should be able to decode. By mid-November, he'd recorded 17 appearances. Plotting them on a map of Savannah's historic district, he noticed they formed a rough circle around 3 locations: Clary's Old Cafe on Bull Street, Colonial Park Cemetery, and Memorial Hospital. The hospital was where Sarah had worked. The cafe was where they'd met. The cemetery was where nurses from generations past were buried, including, possibly, Sarah's ancestor. Daniel sat in his apartment one Saturday afternoon, studying the map spread across his coffee table, when his phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, his oldest friend and a history professor at Savannah College of Art and Design. "You busy?" Marcus asked. "I need a second opinion on something." 30 minutes later, Daniel was standing in Marcus's cluttered campus office, surrounded by teetering stacks of books about Savannah history and Gula culture. Marcus, a tall man with graying locks and reading glasses perpetually perched on his head, gestured to a box of old documents on his desk. "Got these from an estate sale last week," Marcus explained. "Papers belonging to a family that's been in Savannah since the 1700s. There's some fascinating stuff about the yellow fever epidemics, including personal letters from nurses who volunteered. Thought you might be interested since you're working on the Mercer House. There's some architectural descriptions that might help with the restoration." Daniel flipped through the documents carefully, his architect's eye appreciating the detailed sketches of buildings long since demolished. Then he found a letter dated October 1876, written in careful cursive script. "My dearest sister, I write this, knowing I may not have the strength to post it. The fever has claimed another 6 patients today, and I fear I am next. But I cannot abandon those who remain. Margaret Brennan taught me that nursing is not merely a profession, but a sacred duty. Even as she lay dying, she continued to comfort others. I shall try to honor her memory by doing the same." Daniel's hands trembled. "Marcus, do you have any more information about this Margaret Brennan?" Marcus consulted a ledger he'd been cross-referencing. "Margaret Brennan, aged 32, died October 19, 1876, of yellow fever. Unmarried, no children. Buried in Colonial Park Cemetery with other nurses who died during the epidemic. Why? I know someone whose ancestor was a nurse named Brennan, died in the yellow fever epidemic." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Small world. Or small city, I suppose. Savannah families tend to interweave after a few generations." He pulled out another document. "Here's something interesting. There's a notation in the hospital records that Margaret Brennan's few possessions were held in trust for any future descendants who might claim them. A brass lamp, some medical instruments, and a collection of letters. The lamp was claimed in 1982 by a Sarah Brennan." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Daniel sat down hard in Marcus's spare chair. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, concerned. "Sarah Brennan, when did she claim the lamp?" Marcus checked the records. "October 1982. Says here she was a nurse at Memorial, researching her family history. She signed for the items and donated the medical instruments to the hospital's historical collection, kept the lamp and letters." He paused. "Daniel, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Daniel said quietly. That evening Daniel walked to Memorial Hospital. The November sky was deepening to purple, and the old oaks cast long shadows across the sidewalks. He'd called ahead and gotten permission to visit the historical collection, a small room tucked into the hospital's oldest wing where they kept artifacts from Savannah's medical history. The curator, a kind woman named Patricia, showed him to the display case containing Margaret Brennan's donated instruments, a stethoscope, a fever thermometer, various surgical tools that looked medieval compared to modern equipment. "Beautiful craftsmanship," Patricia noted. "These were expensive items for the time." Margaret Brennan must have been quite dedicated to invest in such quality instruments. The records say Sarah Brennan claimed these items in 1982, Daniel said. Do you have any information about her? Patricia's expression softened. Oh, Sarah, yes, I knew her. She worked here for almost 15 years. Wonderful nurse, incredibly compassionate. She left Savannah rather suddenly in 2013. Family emergency, I believe. We all hoped she'd come back, but she never did. Patricia paused. She used to say that nursing was in her blood, that she felt her ancestor watching over her while she worked. I always thought it was a lovely sentiment. Daniel's throat felt tight. Do you know where she went? I'm sorry, I don't. She was private about her personal life. But I know she cared deeply about this hospital, about Savannah. She once told me she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Patricia tilted her head, studying Daniel. Did you know her? Briefly, Daniel said. A long time ago. That night, the light appeared in Daniel's apartment again. But this time, instead of hovering at the window, it moved through his living room like a presence, pausing near his bookshelf where he'd kept the Mary Oliver collection Sarah had given him. The book was still there, spine uncracked, because Daniel had never been able to bring himself to read it after she disappeared. He pulled it from the shelf now. Inside the front cover, Sarah had written in her neat script, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness." It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. Mary Oliver, for Daniel, who's learning to carry light even when it's heavy. S. The light brightened, pulsed 3 times, then settled into a steady glow near the window. Daniel understood then, with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This wasn't a haunting. It wasn't supernatural intervention or divine mystery. It was simpler and more profound than that. Sarah hadn't died. She'd left Savannah for reasons he didn't know. But the light wasn't her spirit. It was her influence, her continued presence in the shape she'd given his life. The lamp she'd claimed from her ancestor had likely sat in her apartment window for years, a brass fixture that caught the evening light in a particular way. He'd seen it himself that one time he'd picked her up, though he hadn't registered its significance. The light he'd been seeing wasn't following him. He'd been unconsciously following a pattern Sarah had established in his mind 12 years ago, walking the routes they used to walk together, noticing the places they'd shared conversations, allowing his grief-trained eyes to find meaning in reflection and refraction, because that's what she'd taught him to do, to look for light even in darkness. And maybe she'd left the lamp burning in her window, wherever she'd gone, as a way of keeping vigil for the city she'd loved and the people she'd cared for. Maybe it was coincidence that its glow seemed to reach across distance and time. Or maybe devotion created its own kind of physics, bending light around the curves of memory until it arrived exactly where it needed to be. Daniel sat by his window, the poetry book open in his lap, and let himself finally mourn the loss he'd been too numb to process 12 years ago. He cried for his father, for his mother, for the young man he'd been, who'd been too wounded to accept the gift Sarah had offered. Not romance, but something equally valuable. The reminder that grief didn't have to be carried alone, that kindness existed without condition, and that some connections ran deeper than the time allotted to them. The light remained steady, warm, patient as always. December brought the kind of soft weather Savannah did best, cool mornings that warmed to gentle afternoons, the oaks still green while the rest of the country froze. Daniel finished the Mercer House restoration and immediately took on a new project, researching the architectural history of Memorial Hospital's oldest wing for a preservation grant proposal. It was transparent, even to himself, that he was looking for Sarah. Marcus helped him comb through hospital records, city directories, and old photographs. They found Sarah Brennan's employment history. She'd worked at Memorial from 1998 to 2013, consistently receiving excellent reviews. Her last known address was an apartment on Taylor Street, but when Daniel walked by, different people lived there now. The landlord had no forwarding address. Maybe she wanted to disappear, Marcus suggested gently one afternoon as they worked through another box of records in the hospital's archives. Some people leave because staying means drowning in the past. I just want to thank her, Daniel said. She was there for me when I needed someone, and I never told her what it meant. Marcus gave him a long look. You know, sometimes the gratitude isn't about finding the person. It's about living the life they helped make possible. Becoming the person they saw in you. Daniel thought about that as he walked home that evening, his usual route down Bull Street past where Clary's used to be. The light appeared right on schedule, warm and steady on the old lamppost. He stopped beneath it, looking at the corner where Sarah used to sit with her coffee and her genuine smile, and realized Marcus was right. Sarah had seen something in him that he couldn't see himself. Resilience, strength, the capacity to carry grief without letting it crush him. She'd offered him friendship at a moment when friendship was exactly what he needed, asking nothing in return, except that he show up and be present. She'd given him poetry to read and space to heal, and the quiet assurance that loss didn't have to mean the end of connection. And then she'd left, perhaps because her own grief or circumstances demanded it, trusting that he'd be okay without her constant presence. The light wasn't supernatural. It was memory made tangible through attention. It was the way Sarah's influence had trained his eye to notice moments of warmth and beauty, even in routine passages home. It was the lamp she might still keep burning somewhere, a small ritual of devotion to the city and profession she'd loved. It was the brass fixture her ancestor had owned, claimed and cherished as a link to legacy and purpose. Most of all, it was Daniel's own heart, finally ready to acknowledge a debt of gratitude that had been waiting 12 years to be spoken aloud. He stood beneath the street lamp and spoke to the empty corner, to the memory of a woman with dark hair braided over one shoulder and eyes that collected light like river stones. Thank you, Sarah, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for sitting with me in my grief without trying to fix it, for teaching me that kindness doesn't need to be earned or repaid, just received and passed forward. I'm sorry I never said this when you were here, but I'm saying it now. You made a difference. You changed the shape of my life. And I hope, wherever you are, you know that you're still helping people, still guiding them home, still offering the same gentle presence you gave me. The light pulsed once, bright and warm. Daniel smiled, tears running freely down his face. He didn't know if Sarah could hear him across whatever distance separated them. He didn't know if the light was truly connected to her, or just his own mind, creating meaning where physics said there should be none. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd finally honored what she'd given him, acknowledged the quiet weight of her influence, and allowed himself to feel the full measure of gratitude he'd been carrying all these years. He pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "Hey," Daniel said when his friend answered. "You know that grief support group at Memorial you mentioned? The one from the flyer? I think I'm ready to try it." "Yeah, that's good, man. That's really good. And I was thinking maybe I could volunteer there too, nothing formal, just being present for people the way someone was present for me once." Marcus's voice was warm with approval. "Sarah would be proud of you." "Oh, maybe," Daniel said, looking at the light one more time. "Or maybe she already knew I'd get here eventually. She was good at seeing things other people missed." That night, Daniel finally read the Mary Oliver poems. He read about wild geese and grasshoppers, about the way grief and love were simply different words for the same fierce attachment to life. He read until dawn lightened his window, and when he looked outside, the light was gone. It didn't return the next evening or the one after that. Bull Street was just Bull Street again, beautiful and historic, and free of amber glimmers. Daniel walked his usual route without supernatural accompaniment and found he didn't miss the light as much as he'd expected. It had served its purpose, reminded him of a debt unpaid, guided him toward gratitude, helped him finally mourn what needed mourning. 3 weeks before Christmas, Daniel's phone rang with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Daniel Marsh. The voice was older, weathered, but with an accent that suggested long years in Savannah. Yes? My name is Catherine Brennan. I'm Sarah's aunt. She gave me your number years ago, said if anything ever happened to her, you were someone who might want to know. Daniel's heart stopped. Is she... She's fine, Catherine said quickly. She's in Charleston now, teaching nursing at the university. But she's been sick. Nothing serious, just pneumonia that took longer to shake than expected, and it got her thinking about things left unsaid. She asked me to call you. Sarah asked you to call me. Daniel could barely breathe. She said to tell you she's sorry for leaving so suddenly. Her father had a stroke, and she moved to Charleston to care for him. By the time things settled, she felt too much time had passed to reach out, but she's thought of you often. She wanted you to know that. Daniel sat down hard on his couch. Could I have her number? Catherine gave it to him, then added softly, She also said to tell you she's glad you're okay. She said she always knew you would be. After they hung up, Daniel stared at the number on his phone for a long time. Finally, he composed a text. Hi, Sarah. It's Daniel. Your aunt called. I'm so glad you're okay. I've been wanting to thank you for 12 years for what you did for me. You saw me when I couldn't see myself, and it changed everything. I'm doing good now, really good. Thank you for being the light when I needed it most. The response came 15 minutes later. Daniel, I can't believe Catherine found you. I've thought of you so often. You were never as broken as you thought you were. You just needed time and space to heal. I'm so happy you're well. Coffee sometime if you're ever in Charleston? I'd love to hear about your life. Yes, Daniel smiled, crying again, but this time with pure joy. I'd like that very much. Maybe in the new year. It's a date. Well, not a date. You know what I mean. I do. Still friends. The best kind. That evening, Daniel walked down to Colonial Park Cemetery with a bouquet of white roses. He found the nurses' section near the eastern wall and placed the flowers at the base of the weathered headstones, including the one Marcus had helped him identify as belonging to Margaret Brennan. Thank you, he said quietly to the stone, to the woman who died caring for others, to the legacy of compassion that had flowed from her to Sarah and from Sarah to him. Thank you for teaching your descendants what devotion looks like. It's still making a difference all these years later. The December sunset painted the cemetery in shades of amber and gold, light reflecting off the iron fence and the old stones and the dogwood tree that would bloom brilliant white come spring. Daniel stood there until the last of the light faded, feeling the presence of all the people who'd loved this city enough to stay, to serve, to offer their whole hearts to the work of caring for others. Then he walked home through the beautiful haunted streets of Savannah, past the squares and the fountains and the old oaks dripping with moss. The street lamps flickered on as dusk deepened to night, each one casting its own warm glow on the cobblestones, guiding everyone safely home. And if one particular light on Bull Street seemed slightly warmer, slightly more amber than the others, well, that was just Savannah being Savannah, a city built on the layered presence of everyone who'd ever loved it, their influence lingering like light through Spanish moss, gentle and constant, and always there when you needed it most. Daniel looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and smiled. Sarah was right, as she'd always been. He was okay, more than okay. He was finally fully home.